Oh my God, I hate it when I lose sight of the timer and I get on a roll and then it interrupts. So and I'm sorry to you guys because it makes for a really unnatural break. So what we were talking about here is if this is my desired conclusion, right? News that supports that conclusion gets the benefit of my doubt that I like that news better. And news that doesn't support my conclusion, I look at this news as poorly constructed, poorly obtained, and maybe even lies, right? And notice that in the last 3 or 4 years, what became a very common term and is still being used to this day is the statement fake news. So if there is news that disagrees with what I believe, or disagrees with my agenda, or disagrees with what I want other people to believe, I can simply label that fake news, and then that allows me to dismiss it. Notice it's not an empirical test, it's not referencing data, it's just a mere pronouncement that this is fake news. And let's face it, this is kind of like toddler level thinking. Right? I don't like it, and because I don't like it, it's bad. And what I like is good. And we see in Kohlberg's moral reasoning terms, that's like level 2 out of 6. So this is one of the benefits of science, is we say, hey, this is the news. Is there some way that I can verify this or not verify it? What data do I need? So this would be akin to scientific methodology. Now what Kunda's saying is, though, that motivated reasoning, we're motivated to want a certain outcome. That's our desire, our preference. So we will pick and choose information that supports our preference. Now, she goes on in the second part that we didn't get to, and I do not attempt to address a thorny issue of how such motives are represented. And this is still a huge issue, because what does a motivation look like in the brain? Let's do the neuroscience. Let's put someone in the tube. Let's put them in the fMRI machine. Find me a motivation. What does that look like? Ain't going there yet. We don't have the chops to get there yet. But this article that Kunda wrote in '91, and an accompanying article around the same time, there were 2, on motivated reasoning, she said, look, here's the deal. We already have evidence that motivation exists. We have, 80 years worth of psychological research at this point, if we want to start at 1900, 1910, just for social psychological research. We have this research. The problem is that all of these researches never had motivation as an element of the hypothesis. So you might pull out this study that was done in 1978 and say, look, motivation, but you can't do that. Because if motivation wasn't in the hypothesis, then you're adding it on afterwards, after you've already seen the results. And you see, this is evidence of motivation, and you say, but you never hypothesized it in the first place. So we are wedded to confirmatory hypothesis testing, and she says, basically then what we have to do as psychological scientists is we have to revisit a ton of these old studies and say, hey, look, this is a pretty good example of motivation. How do we redo this study and incorporate motivation into the new hypothesis? So it's like doing a replication on the one hand and an extension as well. Well, Kunda lit a lot of people on fire, man, and they're like, oh my God, this is what we needed to hear, and we are going to go crazy, and we're going to get busy, and we are in fact going to demonstrate one way or another that motivation exists. And the first person who did this, I think, well, here, let's look at the 2 categories of motivated reasoning first. So 2 types of motivated reasoning. One is to arrive at an accurate conclusion, and this would be consistent with what all the cognitive people said. They said the software is designed to generate accurate conclusions. They never used the term motivation. I don't know how they kind of skipped around that. They did successfully, and they're very intelligent people, so why not, right? But sometimes we want to arrive at a particular directional conclusion. And then there's reality constraints, though, that we're not at liberty to believe just anything. So I want to tell a brief story about Pete Ditto, and I was so fortunate when I did my undergraduate at University of California, Irvine. I got there as a junior because I transferred from community college, and as soon as I got there, I started thinking in terms of maybe grad school. I talked to some people just to leave my options open, and they say, well, if you want to go to grad school, you need letters of recommendation. If you need letters of recommendation, the best way to get those is to work in a research laboratory. So I talked to a couple professors, and I got research assistant gigs with Dr. Linda Levine, who especially studied development of emotion in children, which was a really cool lab to work with, and John Rice and Kim Babb. I still remember the two graduate students I did research with. Man, they were so good, and I felt like I was getting such a great education. And then I worked in Ditto's lab, Pete Ditto. And Dr. Ditto is the first one to develop a study that showed that motivation does exist, empirically can be supported and demonstrated. And it was a cool study. What he had people do, people came into the lab and they were told that we were testing a new test strip. And this test strip, what it would do is determine the presence of an enzyme. And one of the manipulations, there's a couple variations on this, but the manipulation was that they were told that the test strip, to show the presence of the enzyme, would change color, or if the enzyme was absent, the test strip would change color. And the way they work it then, and it was fascinating to watch, and also how it plays out to demonstrate how Ditto's going to empirically demonstrate motivation as a human quality. What would happen then is people would take the test strip, which was actually just a piece of construction paper cut in strips, like, you know, construction paper like we used as kids in school. And it was a saliva test. So what you were instructed to do, you have the instructions, you have a little cup, right? And you have a cup of test strips, and you're supposed to spit in the cup, and then you take a Q-tip and you put it in the spit and you rub it on the strip. And what would happen is, if the strip doesn't change color, in a nutshell, it's either a positive result for some people in one condition, or it's a negative result in the other condition. So people who are in the positive no change color strip, they spit in the cup, they wipe it on, they wait the prescribed amount of time, 10 seconds, right? And they say the strip doesn't change color, and they say, freaking awesome, I'm good to go, glad to find I'm healthy, right? And then they would put the strip in the envelope as they were instructed, and then they pick up a questionnaire. What do you think about the test? How accurate is the test? What's the quality of the test, right? That's the control condition. And this is all videotaped, so it's fascinating. Now, the experimental condition is where it's bad if this strip remains the same color. So these people spit, and then they take the Q-tip, right? And then they wipe it on the strip, and they hold the strip for the 10 seconds, and it doesn't change color. And you watch them. They get nervous. They get anxious about this, right? And so a lot of people do different things. They'll wait longer. So they'll wait 20 seconds, well, 10 seconds, so I'll wait 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And then if it doesn't work, they would discard the strip. Some people, one person even put the strip in their back pocket, like to hide it, right? And then they pull out another strip, and they do it again, and they'd wait, and it wouldn't change, right? And then they would discard that strip. And then some people actually spit more into the cup, and they actually dipped a new strip into the spit, not even using the Q-tip, and it still wouldn't change, right? And you see people getting wigged out, right? Because they're getting a bad result. Notice how this aligns with Kunda's ideas. People who get the result they want, their reasoning is simple. They test it, boom, they're out of there, and they rate the test as being a good test. People who can't get the strip to change and believe that it should be a good outcome, then do all these extra shenanigans with the strips. Multiple tests, extending the time, applying saliva directly, licking the strip, right? All this crazy other stuff. But what's most telling, well, that's probably most telling, but what is kind of like the icing on the empirical cake, if you will, is that people then go to the questionnaire and they rate the test less favorably. They see flaws in the test, or they communicate those things. Because the test didn't give them the result they wanted, now the test is flawed. They're diminishing the test. This is motivation at work. And the deal is, you cannot explain the result, and this is frickin' Ditto's kind of laser beam mind, right, and his ultimate experience and skill as a researcher has developed a situation when you go to a conference and you present this research, or when you submit the paper, counter arguments are virtually impossible to create. What would cause someone to do additional testing when it's a bad result, but would not do additional testing when it was a good result? And motivation becomes about the only explanation that's plausible under this circumstance. So Ditto is one of the, and he did this in several different ways, but this Ditto was one of the first people. And I was so fortunate to get to work with him and kind of get the inside track on this. So then when I went to go to graduate school, where do I end up? Well, I chose to come to Ohio State, and I chose to work with Phil Tetlock. And I didn't understand this about Tetlock at the time, but he knows all the social psychologists out there. He knows that Ditto is big with the motivated reasoning and demonstrating motivation. And what Tetlock was looking was for a graduate student who had some background in motivation, and that happened to be me. So that's how I get into Tetlock's lab. Now, what Tetlock is going to do, and this is a long-term project. Tetlock is working on this. Remember I said the motivation, cognition debate, he wrote that article way back in '82. This is something that Tetlock is working on for decades, right? Incrementally moving towards empirically demonstrating a certain type or types of motivation. And we're going to call these mindsets, so it's been a long story to get here. But if Harold Kelly and the cognitive people are calling us intuitive scientists, Tetlock is saying, yeah, sometimes people, a good descriptor of people, a good metaphor, if you will, for the way people reason is they want to be accurate. We could look at them as intuitive scientists. But Tetlock said sometimes people don't want to be accurate. Sometimes people have other agendas besides accuracy. And if their agenda is not accuracy, but their agenda implies something different, a different mindset, then we're going to call these the intuitive scientist as a functionalist metaphor from Kelly. But Tetlock is saying there's other functionalist metaphors that could be applied to human reasoning. And he called them deviant functionalist metaphors. And to know Tetlock is to know his love for the language and his ability to turn a phrase. So three other mindsets that demonstrate motivation rather than the accuracy motivation like intuitive scientist are the intuitive prosecutor, the intuitive theologian, and the intuitive politician. So now what we're saying is when people want to come to an accurate conclusion, the metaphor to describe their behavior is the intuitive scientist. But what if someone doesn't want to come to an accurate conclusion? What if they'd prefer a biased conclusion? And now what we're talking about is the context. The situation matters. People are smart enough to decode their situation, and understanding the situation they're in, they also understand the situation that they want to get to. And they will deviate from accuracy motives to other motives to assist their desire, their motive, or to play out their motivation to get to another situation. So the realization that sometimes right is wrong, wrong is right, that the situation has impact on what is considered right or wrong. And it clearly then reflects one of my favorite words, and you got to know I love this this cartoon, right? Because you got the inbox, you got the outbox, but you got the it depends box, and what's one of my favorite words? Depends. And I guess that makes me a full card-carrying member of the Tetlock Lab. So it led us to search for situations where previous observations no longer are found or often reversed. Now let's talk about some of these deviant functionalist metaphors. Right? The intuitive prosecutor. When do people behave like intuitive prosecutors rather than intuitive scientists? Well, if the system, the social system that we live in looks like it's under threat, that our way of life or the justice system or crime is out of control, if we have people coming into the country who are unwanted, etc., then rather than analyze the data as intuitive scientists and understand the true nature of the situation, we analyze data in such a way that allows us or justifies us to come down harder on people who are violating the norms, the laws that we're holding dear. So the motivation now is not to come to an accurate conclusion, let's say in a court of law. It's just like the old cowboy shows. Man, there's people stealing horses. We can't have horse stealing because we live and die by the horse. And what do we do about horse thieves? Well, we don't bring them into court and try them. What we do is say, hey, look, this guy's a horse thief. That's good enough for me. Let's string him up on the nearest oak tree and let's just hang him out here. So we get away from the trial. We get away from accurate testimony. We get away from empirically supported conclusions, if you will, and we just take matters into our own hands. Right? So, and if you want some really fun reading, this is like the culmination of Phil's work in this regard is people as intuitive prosecutors, and it's the impact of social control goals and attributions of responsibility. Bottom line, what we found is the more severe a crime, the more it activated the need to punish. That is, it motivated people to punish. Someone's got to pay. And notice, if someone's got to pay, then evidentiary standards were diminished. So while evidence is going to be all important to an intuitive scientist, to an intuitive prosecutor, we don't need as much evidence to get to that conviction, right? So the intuitive prosecutor mindset then is an attributional style. It processes information, it looks at evidence in such a way that allows us to prosecute people more readily, right? We don't give people benefit of the doubt. We're less likely to listen to excuses or alibis. And notice, we call alibis excuses at this point in time, or look at them negatively. So we weight information, and this is where it gets tricky, and this is where we're so cognitively flexible. We lower the threshold for a conviction. We need less evidence to convict a person than we would if the prosecutorial mindset has not been instigated. And a lot of what we did in the laboratory is find ways to instigate the prosecutorial mindset and then watch people need less evidence to vote guilty. Right? And often we did this by saying that a crime is out of control. And if people believe crime is out of control, then they need less evidence to prosecute an individual for that crime than if they believe crime is in control. So by the crime control statistic instigates the motive by making people feel fearful or angry, or it reduces the potential to instigate the motive because people feel safe and secure. So when are excuses then accepted or not? Well, it depends, and it depends on people's social control motivation. So it can depend on who offers the excuse, right? What we see here, Tetlock et al., Penny Visser and Phil Tetlock, if police officers offered an excuse, then the excuse was more likely to be accepted in a same situation than if a civilian or criminal offered the identical excuse under the identical circumstances. It can depend on how serious the offense. We're more willing to entertain excuses when the stakes are low rather than when the stakes are high, right? It can depend on the threat that the act poses. So those that represented greater threats to society then need less information or evidence to prosecute. Now that was the first one, and that's the most robustly demonstrated throughout the literature, was the intuitive prosecutor motive. And notice this is something that's done in politics today. We have caravans of illegal aliens coming to do harm to our society and destroy everything that we know and love. What's the actual data? Well, notice people don't have that conversation on the data. What they want to do is just generate the emotion which leads to the creation of the prosecutorial mindset. So then we have to come down harder on people. We put people in cages without giving them trials. Ideas like that, which is something that Americans, and the Constitution pretty much prohibits, but we find ways to do it if we believe that the danger is high enough, that we're motivated to walk away from our constitutional roots, so to speak. Now, side issue on this, the intuitive theologian. In this case, it's not about the social order, it's about the moral order. So everything I've said about the intuitive prosecutor essentially applies to the theologian. It's just a different circumstance. Instead of legal, right, and safety issues, this is moral issues. So if we believe the moral fabric of the nation is dissolving or being torn apart, and so for intuitive theologians, non-negotiable issues, once they've had the theologian activated, is like choice, right to choice versus banning abortion. Would be one example of these kind of taboo trade-offs. Questions about that? Okay. So, refusing treatment for a child because it's too expensive, although the child will die as a result. And notice that that would be a taboo, that's not someplace we can go. But in this case, in today's day and age, we're already talking about who gets a ventilator and who doesn't and under what circumstances. And the big question is, why doesn't we have ventilators for everybody? So, and then the intuitive politician, and this is obviously a motivation to make a good impression, please one's audience, and this means I'll say anything. I'm no longer bound by facts, I'm no longer bound by reality. I will say anything as long as it gets applause from the audience or gets me a vote at this point in time. one example of this, I can't believe it. I attended a Q&A at a different school, not our school, right? And I remember the dean getting up there and explaining that there were two different types of permanence in the answer to a question. And he said there's permanent permanence and there's temporary permanence. And we're like, most of us are like, say what? You want to explain that? That makes no effing sense. Either it's temporary or permanent. There's no temporary permanent. What the hell does that mean? Right? But he's saying whatever he can say to try and advance whatever political agenda he was working on. Also, you know, the term now that's common and labeled as alternative facts. So what do we know? Chronic motivations can be chronic. That is, people carry this style of thinking around with them. It's part of their personality. It's a trait level thing. Or it can be temporary. And it can be in response to a news event. And the joy of this was, though, we can manipulate it and study it in a laboratory setting. So, governments, press cause emotional response. That manipulates perceptions, cause and reasoning to be distorted or at least affected, and activates action tendencies, justifies responses. So this is all the things we've discussed. We're flexible thinkers, and it's a blessing and it's a curse at the same time. So we started with boots in our babies, and I think we ought to end with boots in our babies. So there's boots in at least one of our babies. You guys stay safe, be well, and we'll come back soon for chapter 14. Bye.